All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we try to uh, dive in head first to the many great theories of everything that are out there that most people don't know anything about. All encompassing theories, cosmologies, grand unified theories, tour de forces, and magnum opuses, um, earth-shattering discoveries from obscure sources. And in this case, we're talking about what I would just call kind of the biblical corpus, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi texts, the Apocrypha, all of the books that are kind of from the Palestinian Jewish tradition and forward into the so-called Christian tradition. We're in a unit that's really called the Reciprocal Church, with a nod to Dewey B. Larson of the Reciprocal System of Theory. This is kind of like moving his theory into the religious realm, which he already did, and we went over that a couple years ago when we were going over Dewey Larson's work, his book Beyond Space and Time, and we will look at that a little bit more, where he derives the existence of God from his theory, which is based on space-time physics. The universe is made out of motion. Motion is the relationship between space and time. Space and time are identical to each other, except that they are reciprocals of one another. And as you go out in space, you go in time, and vice versa. And eventually, we get the appearance of what he calls Sector 3. That's what he refers to God as, Sector 3. And Sector 3 is infinite and is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. And it is always good, whereby evil expires at the end of its run. So there is, I would say that's very much of a white pill, but a lot of this is very much of a red pill, especially for Christians, and that's why I'm putting together the Reciprocal Church, putting together alternative resources for spiritual access, such as the Reciprocal System of Theory, sacred geometry, quantum arithmetic, psychedelic entheogens, and we've got intense endurance exercise, and African American creative music from the so-called jazz tradition, which I wrote a book on that we went over a few months ago. And many other sources that I'm trying to kind of compile and put together so that we have our resources once we recognize that both the Jewish and Christian tradition have been discredited, but we just haven't recognized it yet. The Christian tradition, the Gospels, in my view, and I'll be going to be presenting the evidence, the Gospels, the entire New Testament is a psyop written by the Romans, the Roman Caesars, in particular of the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, from 69 to 79, Titus from 79 to 81, and Domitian from 81 to 96 AD. And they backdated the Gospels to put Jesus in the 30s, early 30s AD, where he predicted exactly what was going to happen in the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD, including the so-called abomination of desolation, the destruction of the Jewish temple. And, you know, a lot of Christians use that, not so much anymore, but back in the day, used it as a, you know, the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. Well, or you could just say, oh, well, I wrote this about a character that lived 40 years ago, and he predicted that 40 years from now something would happen. Or, you know, lived 50 years ago, and he predicted that 40 years from now something would happen. That happened 10 years ago. I know about it. You know, I wrote the history of it. And so I'm just going to, you know, have him fulfill all the prophecies. One of those things involves, I suppose, what you would call conspiratorial thinking. The other involves magical thinking. I'll go with the conspiratorial thinking every time. But in addition to all this, now we'll get into this, but you know, we're trying to put together sources. Now, when I talk about the Romans, you know, we talked about how the Romans also diverted the Jewish religion into rabbinical Judaism through this guy Johanan ben Zakkai, and they did the exact same thing with Christianity through Josephus. Exact same thing at the exact same time, by the exact same people for the exact same reason. Because the Jews were a pain in the butt for the Romans. They were always starting revolts, rebellions. They were fighting, and then they totally started this revolt in 66 AD, where, you know, the entire Roman army had to come in and put it down. It took 7 years. And both the emperors, Vespasian and Titus, were generals, and they both got wounded in the war. So they were not pleased. You know, they were like, let's nip this in the bud. They'd done it before, and Vespasian and Titus, you know, they both are gods. They both were declared to be gods by the Roman Senate or whatever. And so it's no surprise that instead of predicting, like, so that's basically what Jesus is. Once you decode this, is that Jesus is the person who prophesies the god Titus. All of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the Gospels are referring to Titus, and possibly Domitian, who is the younger brother of Titus that became emperor after him. He writes a lot of that into Revelation. So different ones of the Flavians wrote different parts of the New Testament. I would say that Vespasian probably put out the 3 of the synoptic Gospels, and then possibly John, and then that Titus redacted John and put some of his own stuff into John. And possibly into Luke as well. And then Domitian possibly wrote the rest of it. Not completely clear on all that. That's what we're doing this for, to try to, you know, resolve the mystery. But, you know, the most important piece of evidence is that Josephus is the writer of the War of the Jews. And Josephus is the only person to have authenticated the existence of Jesus in his own time, in the 1st century. He's the only scholar who mentions the existence of Jesus. I believe Tacitus also mentions somebody named Crestus, who was executed during Tiberius's reign, but the same applies for Tacitus. They are both puppets of the Roman Empire. They both were court, historians living with the Caesars at Rome the whole time they were writing. Josephus was actually the adopted son of Titus after he gave him the star prophecy and said, I foresee that you will be the emperor of Rome. When Vespasian was just a general, he became emperor, and he hooked up Josephus, and he hooked up Ben Zakkai. Now, what we know for sure, he hooked up Ben Zakkai. We also know for sure that the Romans did take over Christianity. The story that we're told is that it didn't happen until 312 or 315 AD with Constantine, where the Roman Catholic Church began. So out of the Roman Empire the story is that Constantine converted to Christianity, and then so he basically made it a part of the Roman Empire. The joke is that it happened 2.5 centuries before that. The Romans created it from the start. They didn't take it over in 312. They did it from the start. And so we're going to demonstrate that. Unfortunately, it's not going to be able to happen in just one video. We're going to have to do it over the course of 20 to 50 videos. It's extremely overwhelming, the amount of evidence, and I'm going to try to present it and do it justice here. But this is not all we're going to do. We're going to also use many other ways to decode the Bible that will also be valid and be relevant. The Bible, as Sun Ra, one of the musicians who I wrote one of my books on, he basically claims to have been visited by extraterrestrials, and they told him that he had to solve the most difficult problem in the world, and he figured out that problem was the true meaning of the Bible. So here's this guy who's like a savant band leader / piano player / keyboard player, and he, according to other people in his band, he had a stack of Bibles all the way up to the ceiling, written in all kinds of different languages, and he said that the Creator taught him how to read the different languages, and so he figured out the real meaning of the Bible. What he would say is that the Bible is not a good book. It's a code book. Because the G's and the C's are always mixed up between the ancient languages, like alpha, beta, gamma, delta. That's supposed to be C, but it's G. So he says the good book is a code book. And I find that to be absolutely true, and that even with the fact that the Romans wrote the Gospels, there is several other layers of coded messages within this thing. So whoever put this together, they put it together with a great deal of care, but they also put it together with a great deal of malice. And Christians might really get on me for talking about this, but I'm doing it for them. This is they need to know about this, because this Bible is mocking them right to their face. They're being mocked by the words, in particular things like the communion is just a symbol of cannibalism, but the Romans put it right into the text, but Christians aren't figuring out. So they're being mocked. They're being humiliated. It was intended to be a humiliation for Jews, but then, Christians came around, and now so it comes right back. The other thing is that probably the greatest writer in the history of the English language, if not all of Western civilization, figured this out as well. And every one of this person's plays are about this same topic. So we'll get into that. Well, a lot of this draws on the, so we're going to get into that, but we're going to first, I guess, go through the different authors that we're going to look at. We're going to look at more than just this, but just an overview, and then an overview of the typology, the way that they parallel and coordinate these messages, these coded messages that they put into the text, so that if you are red-pilled on this, if you understand how it works, it's obvious. If you are in the dark, then you don't get it. It's very similar to, the 17th letter thing that's going on right now. Unfortunately, the 17th letter is also a limited hangout, at least at this point. They're not, or maybe I haven't read them carefully enough, but they seem to be supporting the Bible, the New Testament, and quoting it and stuff like that, where they should be telling us that it's also just like everything else. We tend to think, the red-pilled people tend to think that this conspiracy is only 60 years old, or it's only 200 years old. It's from day one. It's from Adam and Eve. It's from before day one. The conspiracy starts on day one. Right there in Genesis, the real God of the Bible lasts for the first chapter of Genesis, and then he's replaced by God with a small g. It's the first chapter and a couple verses or something. I can't remember how. It's very, it's like a chapter, less than 2 chapters. Okay, so most of this stuff that I've just talked about was written by, I won't say written by, but the author who kind of brings this theory forward is Joseph Atwill. He's got books called Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah that go into these typologies. But there are many other authors who also drew upon this kind of same theme, especially Michael Menescotz, if I'm pronouncing his name right, Menesgotz. And he takes Joseph Atwill's work and he mushrooms it, so to speak, and finds many, many, many more parallels. We're going to be reading the book of Luke coming up here pretty soon, and there are, I don't know how many hundreds of parallels between Josephus's War of the Jews and the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke. Just in the Gospel of Luke, there are like several hundred parallels. But we're going to, so we got Michael Menescotz. There's a work called Creating Christ. There's a work called Operation Messiah. And then we've got kind of the Dead Sea Scrolls way of looking at it from Barbara Thiering, where she talks about how the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were definitely in the same vein as the people who wrote the New Testament, and they used a lot of the same jargon, and she matches it up like crazy in her works, particularly like in terms of like the details, like the maps. She maps it out. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were the people, it was from Qumran, like 20 miles from Jerusalem, and they had like a kind of like a miniature Jerusalem there. And so she contends that, Jesus, she doesn't know about Josephus being a fraud and being a Roman agent, and she doesn't know about, you know, the whole parallels between War of the Jews and the Gospels. But she, you know, links many of the events that are said to have happened in the Gospels to Qumran and not to Jerusalem. Then we've also got John Allegro's work on the sacred mushroom and the cross, where he basically says every time they were like really referring to Jesus, they're really talking about a psychedelic mushroom. We've got, you know, that might sound ridiculous on its face, but he uses a great amount of philology, linguistic analysis to back himself up. We've got Robert Taylor, 17th, 18th century, or 18th, 19th century preacher from London who was jailed many times, who talks about really that the New Testament is not just the New Testament, the whole Bible is really a mythological book, and that almost every time they're referring to anything, they're referring to astrological formations, and particularly the zodiac. And we've got a few other kind of decoding devices as well that we're going to break out. I'll talk about some more a little bit later, tomorrow, the next day. I'm kind of not ready to do this, so I'm just kind of going on the seat of my pants because I need to read about 20 more articles and I need to organize my notes to be ready to do this. So I'm just kind of like doing it about a week before I should be doing it. But Atwill introduces this idea of typology. So the ancient people, especially the Jews, they thought of texts to be read intertextually. Like you read kind of two texts at the same time or three texts at the same time, and they correlate with each other. They introduce something in one, and the same kind of situation happens in the other, and you're supposed to carry over the information from one to the other. And Atwill introduces this typology, and so does the New Testament. Introduces this typology right from the start, from the book of Matthew. So when we're talking about Jesus, Jesus is a type of Moses. Moses was, you know, maybe the first savior or an earlier savior, and Jesus is kind of like walking in his footsteps. So, you know, so when we take a look at the end of Genesis, the last few chapters of Genesis, Joseph, who is the second youngest son of Jacob, he is hated by his brothers, the 12 tribes of Israel, and they try to kill him, and they fail, but he ends up in Egypt as a kind of a slave, but he uses his prophesying abilities to gain the favor of the Pharaoh. And at a certain point, he becomes kind of like the Pharaoh's right-hand man. And so the end of Genesis is talking about that, how Joseph goes to Egypt, and you know, wins over the Pharaoh, and then eventually he sends for his father and all of his brothers. They all kind of show up there. They don't recognize Joseph, and eventually he works it out. He takes the youngest son and holds him back, and eventually Jacob is very upset about it, and the whole crew comes to Egypt. Now we also know that Jesus and Joseph, his father, went to Egypt also, and that was the result of so we've got maybe like the first example of the typology talks about we'll just say that people who look at the Bible as history, I mean, I can see it to a certain extent, but it's not, there's like 300 years that are skipped between the book of Genesis and Exodus. They try to cover it up because they use a couple of different characters named Joseph, but, the first Joseph comes in like 1700 BC or something. It's hard to date it, perfectly, but it's several hundred years before Moses comes to the fore, and the Old Testament just skips it. So we have no idea what happened there. But okay, so when we start with the book of Matthew, first we got in Exodus, Pharaoh, he makes an edict where he says he's going to massacre all of the children under 2 years old. Or I can't remember what the rule was that the Pharaoh used, but he massacred all the males, boys. King Herod does the same thing. Okay, so that's a parallel. Herod hears from the Magi, or the Magi tricked him into thinking that he was one place, but he was another place, and so Herod just orders them to massacre all boys under 2 or something. Okay, so that's the first kind of parallel there. That's Exodus 1 and then Matthew 2, verse 16. Then we go to Exodus 4. I guess this is when finally the people that did this, the Pharaoh, he's dead, and so is Herod. Herod is dead, so it's a green light for Jesus and Joseph to come back to Israel. And I guess it's kind of the same situation for Moses. All the men are dead, Exodus 4, and all the men are dead in Matthew 2:20, or they are dead. Then we go to Exodus 12, and that's where Joseph and Jesus and Mary and whoever else move back from Egypt to Israel. Or, sorry, that's when Moses and his crew move back. His crew of, 600,000 men? That's like, 2 million people. That's like, 20 stadiums of 100,000 people. There's no, that's just a ridiculous number, a ridiculous story. There's no way that anybody is going to sustain 2 million people in the desert for 40 years. Not even for 45 minutes. They had 1/4 of that crowd at Woodstock for 3 days, and they completely trashed the place. Okay, yeah, those were hippies on acid or whatever, but the Jews were also putting together golden calves, so I'm sure they weren't that well behaved either. But they were out there for not for 3 days, but for 40 years. Okay, that's just an aside of how ridiculous that story is. Then, okay, so they go back to Israel. Then Exodus 14 talks about, I think that's the parting of the Red Sea, passing through water. And then it talks about Jesus' baptism in Matthew 3:13. Exodus 16, they are tempted by bread. In Matthew 4, verse 4, Jesus is tempted by bread. Exodus 17, do not tempt God. Matthew 4, verse 7, do not tempt God. Exodus 32, worship only God. And Matthew 4:10, worship only God. So now this isn't making any points. This is just a demonstration of the typology. So the people who wrote the New Testament, they knew the story of Moses from the Old Testament, and they tried to kind of put Jesus in the same footsteps as Moses to kind of show that he was a savior. It's kind of the way the ancients were thinking about using texts. They use them together, and so they put these two texts together and they put all these parallels in it so that you kind of know that this is kind of what you're looking for. This is new savior, and many biblical scholars have discussed these parallels. This is not really something that's terribly controversial, and it doesn't have really any bearing on the stuff that we're going to be talking about, but it's just an example of the typology, how they put these things together. So when we get to the actual typologies between War of the Jews by Josephus and the New Testament, we'll be using the same kind of technique where there are parallel events. But in Atwill's case, in many of the cases, not only are the events parallel, but several events occur parallel in the same sequence. So you might have 50 events, or I think it's 40 events that go one after the other in one book, and then the same sequence in the other. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we'll resume tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today.